Welcome to part 2 of this series on principled negotiation. In the last presentation, we reviewed positional bargaining. To briefly summarize what we talked about what a bargaining position is. A bargaining position is a calculated statement of what a negotiator believes they must fight for in order to get what they really need. Each party will start with a position and fight for it, maybe giving up small concessions or maybe demanding concessions from the other side. This seems to be the most common default way that people bargain, but it isn't the most effective or the most efficient way to bargain. Positional bargaining has quite a long list of unspoken costs. Hard bargaining, for example, tends to produce stubbornness, intransigence. It causes the bargaining sides to hold fast in their position, and this can be very discouraging or an obstacle to reaching agreements. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got soft bargainers who are willing to give up their positions, perhaps positions that they'd best not be giving up, but they would be willing to make sacrifices in the agreement in order to keep a relationship. And what that can end up producing are unsatisfying, watered-down compromises. So today, we're going to move on from that point and talk about principled negotiation. Principled negotiation is also known as negotiation on the merits. And what that means is that it is, instead of talking about a bargaining position, the demand that that each of the parties begin the discussion by making, and instead looking more deeply underneath the bargaining positions at what the merits of the case are that for the position that they're trying to gain in the negotiation. Now, negotiation is, as the slide here says, more of an art form than a science. And in our conversation today, we're not going to start talking about a series of steps that, if you follow them like a scientist would an experiment, you will always come out with a great agreement. No, human life is a little messier than that. But there are 4 principles of negotiation that we're going to start considering now, which, if in putting them all together you were to make part of your regular negotiating behavior, can make a very significant difference in reaching agreements that are more satisfying, more longer lasting, and ultimately do create an environment where the relationships that you may be seeking to have are facilitated. So let's start looking at the first of these 4 principles. We'll be just looking at the first of the 4 principles in this video. The first of the 4 principles is to separate the people from the problem. That means that you can look at a dispute or an agreement that needs to be struck from the perspective of fighting with the other individual, which is what happens with hard bargaining, or you can look at it from the perspective of what is the problem that we are trying to solve. Think of it more in terms of a problem-solving conversation rather than a struggle with another individual. Separate the people from the problem. Well, how do you do that? Consider first that negotiators, you and the other party, are people before they're negotiators. We are all individuals, persons with our own thoughts, our own needs, our own interests, and we represent our groups. Could be our nations, our tribes, our companies, or our families. We represent other people who are also individuals. And if we reduce each of the people who are in the situation we're negotiating to just part of a problem, or people that we have to defeat in the way of getting to the resolution that we want, we're not going to be able to get away from the positional bargaining. We must consider first that negotiators are people too, are people first. The person you're negotiating with is as much of a deserving of respect, and their ideas are as deserving of being listened to as yours are. So you want to focus on values in order to respect the people involved. Values of respect, values of the golden rule. Treat others as you would want to be treated. You want to walk a mile in their moccasins, so the Native American Indian expression goes. Try to view the situation through their perspective. Consider what they have gone through in order to get to the negotiating table. What are the experiences that they've had? The situation as it occurs to them because of the experiences that they've had. And if you can understand the experiences or the background that they have come through to get there, then you will be better able to understand their words, the things that they're saying, the things that they're asking for. To separate people from the problem, you also want to address the other party's concerns. That means not dismissing them offhandedly or laughing at them or saying that's ridiculous, but actually believing that just as your interests are important to you, your concerns are important to you. The concerns of the other party are important to them. And until they're certain that you are willing to listen to their concerns, they're not going to be very interested in listening to yours either. So rather than attacking them as a person, listen to their concerns. Be willing to talk about their concerns. To separate people from the problem also means to avoid blaming and labeling. One of the first rules of warfare is to dehumanize your opponent, to say they're less than human. Well, once you've covered that step, then it's no small matter, really, to consider going to war, to taking another life. And in the context of negotiation, if we are willing to criticize or blame or label the other party, we're not going to be able to negotiate with them on a level playing field. Now, while you're talking with the other party and you're making your every effort to separate the people from the problem, you're making every effort to treat them with respect, what happens if they're not playing along and they try to personalize the discussion and focus on you? One thing you can do is to not react, to not defend yourself, to use what we call negotiation jiu-jitsu, which means that every time they turn the lens on you, you redirect the conversation back to the interests in the matter. You keep looking back to the problem. If they try to make you the problem, look behind their statements. Find out what it is that their concern is, and give validity to their concern as much as you can. Don't defend yourself. Invite questions. The kind of questions that will direct the conversation back to the problem. So in the same sense that you are trying to separate people from the problem, and you're not making your opponent, your adversary, the other party in the discussion, into the problem, you're seeing them as a person. Every time they try to make you the problem, just do the same thing with their statements. Don't attack them, just take their statements and redirect them. By doing so, the other party very well may begin to recognize that they're not going to fluster you, they're not going to direct your attention from the problem onto something else, because usually the personal attack is an attempt to intimidate. But just keep focusing on the problem, not the... Confusing the people with the problem leads to blaming, labeling, and false assumptions. If we are unable to look at the problem for what it is and we keep focusing our attention on them as a person, we're going to be making all kinds of false assumptions about them. Assumptions that, well, what is an assumption? An assumption is a belief that we have in our mind that we don't question. We just believe it's true just because. But all of our assumptions are not always right. And if we move forward on the basis of false assumptions, if it's in a decision-making situation, if it's in a leadership situation, and we're acting on the basis of false assumptions, we're going to lead ourselves into missteps, into poor decisions. We're not going to be able to lead our people, our team, our group. So We need to question these false assumptions and take a close look at the perceptions that we have about the other party, which can be misleading. These false perceptions and assumptions will destroy a productive negotiating environment. And that's key for us. If we're trying to have a discussion, a negotiation on the merits, and we want to get away from positional bargaining, our goal is to create a productive environment. We need to be willing to change our beliefs about the other party then in order for that to happen. To separate the people from the problem also involves looking at them as a person that you can try to win over, to make the other party a partner in finding a mutual resolution than as an adversary that must be defeated or bested. This is also part of the negotiation jujitsu. If they are sitting on their side of the table and you're on your side of the table looking at each other and they start to make accusations towards you, well, in a way, jujitsu is like getting out of your chair, walking around to the other side of the table where they're sitting and sitting down next to them and looking at the problem from their vantage point. And in doing so, actually leading them to not look at you, but to look at the problem. So you make the other party a partner in finding a mutual resolution. I think the word mutual is important here. We'll talk about this in subsequent steps. But making the adversary into no longer an adversary, but a partner in the process is key. Now, I also want to mention that emotional intelligence is the ability of a leader or a person to recognize their own feelings and the feelings of others in any given situation and to respond in an appropriate manner. Emotional intelligence for the negotiator means to understand your own feelings about the negotiation, how it's going, what's being said at the negotiating table, and not losing your calm. It also involves recognizing when the other party perhaps is losing their calm. In a hard bargaining position, a negotiator would want to take advantage of that, cause the other party to lose their control, to lose face, because if they lose their composure, then they lose ground, and you might gain over them. But negotiating on the merits, principled negotiation, is not seeking for the other side to be defeated. It's separating the other people from the problem. It's trying to resolve a problem and allowing the people on the other side of the table to save face, to continue to have esteem, to respect them. And so emotional intelligence in a negotiating situation involves being able to recognize your feelings at the negotiating table, their feelings, the emotions that are being expressed at the time, and basically trying to be a peacemaker as far as it goes, helping the other party to feel comfortable, helping yourself to feel comfortable, so that I'm not talking about the soft bargaining position where you're trying to make everybody friendly. That might not necessarily be the case in some negotiations. It might not be possible in all negotiations. But at least you want to have a negotiating environment where all people can successfully use their full attention to resolve the problem rather than attacking each other. So emotional intelligence is enhanced in principled negotiation by seeing the other party as a person apart from the problem, and this helps the whole negotiation to be less threatening. Before I wind up part 2 of this series, I want to ask you a few questions. Since this is a recorded presentation instead of a live one, there won't be discussion, but I do encourage you to consider some questions that are to your benefit in learning principled negotiation. Have you ever been part of a negotiation where the other party turned the spotlight on you instead of the problem? If so, how did that affect you? And how did it affect your willingness to cooperate? Remember that the alternative to a planned and principled approach to negotiating is positional bargaining, which, as we've discussed before, leads us in directions which are more often than not unsatisfying, or just more complicated, less efficient, more problematic than we really need. And so think about it this way. If the objective in reaching agreements is to successfully reach agreements that are going to be lasting, that are going to meet the needs of all parties, because if an agreement doesn't meet the needs of all parties, it's going to be a conflict that's just deferred. It's going to come up again. So the better and more effective an agreement, the longer lasting it's going to be. In order for that to happen, you need to create an environment where agreements can happen. And for that to happen, you need your negotiating counterpart, the other party, to be willing to cooperate. And in order for that to happen, then you need to be able to treat them with respect, to treat them with to look at the problem instead of focusing your attention on them. Again, that comes back to the principle we've just been talking about. I'd like to address one skepticism before we conclude today. And that is a skepticism that some people may have, that the way we're going with this principled negotiation series so far is to start talking about nice humanistic ideals of mutual respect and all that. And after all, that's just a little bit naive. You don't know the hard lot of people that I have to negotiate with and how unreasonable they are and all of the other things that we might say about them. Well, just remember that principled negotiation is a set of principles that work together. This is the first one. I think it's an important one because it sets the stage for the others. And in response to the skepticism about how difficult it is to negotiate with some people, in actuality, the more complicated, the more difficult the negotiating or the bargaining situation is, the more that this principle is needed. And the more that you are able to follow this principle, the more that you will be able to actually influence your counterpart in the negotiation and set the stage for a better negotiation. So that's all for today. I want to thank you for listening in, and stay tuned for part 3. That will be coming to you soon.